In this video, we're going to look at our long-run aggregate supply curve. So if we start off with looking at the relationship between the price level and real GDP, so we're going to have price level on our y-axis and real GDP on our x-axis, we'll see that there's one price level that puts us at our full employment level of real GDP, okay, and that is our long-run aggregate supply curve. So that vertical line, that is our long-run aggregate supply curve, and it is pegged at our full employment level of real GDP. That doesn't mean that it can't increase or decrease, but if our potential GDP is $18 trillion, and by potential I mean our full employment level of real GDP, if it's $18 trillion, then that's where our long-run aggregate supply curve is going to be pegged. So at this level of real GDP, we have our unemployment equal to full employment. Okay, so there's somewhere between 4 and 6% unemployment in the economy, and we're producing as many goods and services as we can. Okay, if we are in our full employment level of real GDP and the market is in a long-run equilibrium, meaning that our aggregate demand and our aggregate supply curve intersect in the same point along that long-run aggregate supply curve, our market is in long-run equilibrium. That means that there is no incentive, I missed that, didn't I? There's no incentive for firms to produce more or less. There's no incentive for consumers to change their buying habits, and the market is extremely stable. So here, this would still be our short-run aggregate supply curve, and this down here is our aggregate demand curve. And where this market is in equilibrium, it is an extremely stable market. Now, however, we're never in the long run for very long. As soon as we get to the long run, some information could possibly change. But here, all of the workers are able to have enough time to understand all of the price level changes and what that means for them. They're able to ask for higher wages and get higher wages. Firms are not overproducing or underproducing. We have the right amount of GDP, and our price level is extremely stable. Let's switch to blue. And our price level is extremely stable, so we'll put our price level at 100. Now, our long-run aggregate supply curve, it is pegged at our full employment level of real GDP, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't shift to the right or to the left whenever we have a change in our resources. So let's say that the economy has a full employment level of real GDP of $17.5 trillion. Okay, so this is our price level, and this is our real GDP, and this is our long-run aggregate supply curve. And in a minute, we'll look at what happens when the long-run aggregate supply curve is not intersecting with the same point where the short-run aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve are intersecting. We'll look at what happens when we have an overheating or an underperforming economy. But right now, let's just look at what causes the long-run aggregate supply curve to shift to the right. Well, if we had an increase in the number of workers, if we had an increase in production technology, if we had an increase in any of our factors of production, our land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, and technology, that would cause us to increase our potential, how much we could possibly produce. So maybe we'd be at $18.2 trillion. If, on the other hand, we had any sort of a reduction in the amount of people that we have, a reduction in our population, if over time our birth rate starts slowing down and we're looking at it 20 years in the future, we would definitely expect there to be a reduction in the amount of GDP that we would be producing. So our long-run aggregate supply curve would shift to the left, and our potential GDP might be somewhere around $16 trillion. So if our actual GDP is the same thing as our potential GDP, then we are in the long run. Then our actual GDP is equal to our potential GDP, then we are in our long run equilibrium. Okay, our long run equilibrium happens when our potential is equal to our actual. So our potential GDP is when we have our full employment, gross domestic product. Okay, after this, we will go ahead and look at what happens when there's disequilibrium in the market and we have either an overheating or an underperforming economy.